In 1897, George Pullman was buried inside a room-sized block of reinforced concrete and steel. His workers hated him so deeply that his family feared they would dig up the body. 17 years later, his daughter used his fortune to build a 98-room French palace on a hilltop above San Francisco Bay. She lived in it for 2 years. Then the palace began to consume everyone who came after her. Before there was a palace, there was a sleeping car. And before there was a sleeping car, there was a man who understood, perhaps better than anyone in 19th century America, that people will pay extraordinary sums of money to be comfortable while moving from one place to another. George Mortimer Pullman was born in 1831 in Brockton, New York, a small town near Lake Erie. He left school after the 4th grade. By his early 20s, he had moved to Chicago and made a reputation for himself in an unusual trade: raising buildings. In the 1850s, the city was attempting to lift itself out of the mud, quite literally, by elevating its streets and the structures along them. Pullman devised a system of coordinated jacks and teams of men that could raise an entire building so smoothly that the businesses inside continued to operate during the procedure. It was precise, profitable work, and it taught him something essential about the relationship between engineering and money. If you could make the impossible feel effortless, people would pay you handsomely for it. He turned that principle toward the railroads. In 1864, he completed his first luxury sleeping car, a vehicle designed to transform the grinding misery of long-distance rail travel into something resembling a hotel on wheels. The timing of what came next was morbid but effective. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865, Pullman arranged to have the president's body carried from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, on one of his sleepers. Hundreds of thousands of Americans lined the route in mourning, and the Pullman name traveled with the coffin into the national consciousness. Orders followed. Within 2 decades, the Pullman Palace Car Company was operating over 2,000 cars on 160,000 miles of track, and George Pullman was one of the wealthiest men in the country. He was also one of the most controlling. In the 1880s, Pullman built an entire town south of Chicago and named it after himself. It was designed to house the workers who manufactured his sleeping cars, and it was, by the standards of industrial America, a handsome place. The homes were tidy. The streets were clean. There was a library, a church, a hotel, and a shopping arcade. But every building, every house, every square foot of that town belonged to George Pullman. Workers were required to rent their homes from the company. They were required to buy their groceries from the company store. Their rent was deducted directly from their wages. There was no saloon because Pullman did not approve of drinking. There was no independent newspaper because Pullman did not approve of dissent. He called it a model community. His workers had another word for it. When the national economy collapsed in 1893, Pullman cut wages by roughly 25%. He did not reduce rents. He did not lower the prices at the company store. Workers who were already struggling found themselves unable to buy food for their families while still paying the full cost of company housing that they were not permitted to leave. In the spring of 1894, a delegation of workers went to Pullman to ask for relief. He refused to meet with them. He had 3 of them fired. The strike began in May. It spread. The American Railway Union, led by a young organizer named Eugene Debs, called on its members to refuse to handle any train carrying a Pullman car. Within weeks, rail traffic across 27 states had ground to a halt. President Grover Cleveland, at the urging of his attorney general, sent federal troops to Chicago. The violence that followed was not a negotiation. It was a suppression. Soldiers fired into crowds. Rail yards burned. By the time it was over, 34 people were dead. And the strike was broken. A presidential commission later condemned Pullman for his refusal to negotiate and for the economic hardships he had imposed on the people who worked for him. It did not matter. He had won. 3 years later, on October 19, 1897, George Pullman died of a heart attack at the age of 66. He left behind a fortune estimated in the tens of millions, a wife, and 4 children. he also left behind a workforce that had not forgotten what he had done to them. His family understood this. They understood it so clearly that they took measures for his burial that had no precedent in American funerary practice. At Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, workers dug a pit 13 feet long, 9 feet wide, and 8 feet deep. They lined the bottom with 18 inches of reinforced concrete. Pullman's body was placed in a lead-lined mahogany casket, which was wrapped in tar paper and coated in asphalt. The casket was lowered into the pit. Then the pit was filled with concrete. On top of the concrete, steel railroad rails were laid in a crosshatch pattern and bolted together. Another layer of concrete was poured over the rails. The entire process took 2 days. When it was finished, sod was laid down, and the grave was sealed. The satirist Ambrose Bierce offered the only fitting epitaph. "It is clear," he wrote, "that the family was making sure the son of a bitch was not going to get up and come back." George Pullman left his daughter Harriet a trust of $1 million to be released when she turned 35. She would use it, along with the rest of her inheritance, to build something that she believed would be beautiful enough to last forever. She was half right. Harriet Pullman was not her father. Where George was blunt, practical, and ruthless, his younger daughter was cultured, restless, and consumed by beauty. Born in Chicago in 1869, she grew up surrounded by the trappings of industrial wealth but drawn always toward something older and more refined. She was educated at home and in Europe. She became fluent in French and German. She attended Miss Brown's Fifth Avenue School in New York and graduated in 1889 as a young woman of exacting taste and fierce independence, qualities she had inherited from her father, though she would have been insulted by the comparison. She moved through the gilded world of Prairie Avenue mansions and Newport summers, of private rail cars and Atlantic crossings, with a restlessness that worried her parents. She flitted, as one account put it, from one beau to another for several years before finally settling on Francis James Carolan, a 29-year-old San Franciscan known chiefly for two things: playing polo and joining clubs. Frank was the son of a wealthy hardware merchant, handsome enough, socially agreeable, and entirely without ambition beyond the next match. The Pullmans were delighted. They wanted their daughter married, and Frank Carolan seemed safe. The wedding took place in 1892 at the Pullman Mansion on Prairie Avenue. George's mother had died just weeks earlier, so the guest list was trimmed from 2,000 to a mere 300. The house had been expanded yet again for the occasion, with a palm room added for the wedding supper. George and Harriet's mother gave the bride diamond necklaces, earrings, bracelets, and a ring. The newlyweds departed for San Francisco aboard the family's private palace car, a Pullman sleeper, naturally, and settled in the Bay Area. The marriage was troubled almost from the start. The couple moved several times. When Harriet's mother visited California and found her daughter living in a house she considered beneath the Pullman name, George wrote a check to rectify the situation. But the deeper problems could not be solved with money. Frank was content with polo and society. Harriet wanted Paris. She wanted architecture, literature, opera, and art. She wanted to build something that would make the world take notice. Frank wanted to be left alone with his horses. When George Pullman died in 1897, Harriet inherited $1 million held in trust until her 35th birthday. The money became available in 1904. By then, she had already established a second home in Paris and had fallen irreversibly in love with French artistic heritage, with the symmetry of classical facades, with the gilded boiseries of 18th-century salons, with the formal gardens that radiated from the great chateau of the Ile-de-France like geometry made visible. She was not simply collecting beautiful things. She was preparing. In 1912, Harriet purchased 554 acres in the western hills of Hillsborough, California, a newly incorporated town of exclusive estates south of San Francisco. The parcel sat at the highest elevation point overlooking the bay. One often repeated story holds that she chose the site specifically so she could look down on the Hearsts. Whether or not that is true, the intent was clear. She was not building a house. She was building a declaration. To realize it, she assembled a team of extraordinary distinction. For the landscape, she hired Achille Duchesne, the most celebrated garden architect in France, a man who had just completed a restoration of the grounds at the Château de Vaux-le-Vicomte outside Paris. Duchesne used those famous gardens as his direct inspiration for Carolands, designing formal parterres that would radiate from the house in 3 directions as far as the eye could see. For the architecture, Harriet secured Ernest Sanson, a Parisian trained at the École des Beaux-Arts, a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, and the designer of some of the most refined private residences in France. Carolands would be only the second house Sanson designed in the United States. To oversee construction on the ground in California, she engaged Willis Polk, San Francisco's most prominent architect of the era. 3 men of impeccable credentials, working under the direction of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. And what she wanted was informed by the very building that had inspired her team. The Château de Vaux-le-Vicomte, completed in 1661 for Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of finances to King Louis XIV, was one of the most influential works of architecture in European history. Its architect, its garden designer, and its painter worked together for the first time on a unified vision of house and landscape that would later serve as the direct prototype for the Palace of Versailles. It was magnificent, and it destroyed the man who built it. Fouquet hosted a lavish housewarming celebration at Vaux-le-Vicomte in August of 1661. The king attended. He saw the grandeur, the fountains, the frescoes, the scale of ambition that Fouquet had permitted himself, and he was not impressed. He was enraged. Within 3 weeks, Fouquet was arrested. He was charged with embezzlement and treason. He was tried, convicted, and imprisoned for the rest of his life. The king then took Fouquet's architects and artisans and set them to work building Versailles. The palace that was meant to crown its creator instead became the instrument of his annihilation. Harriet Pullman Carolan did not know, in 1913, that she was repeating the pattern. She knew only that she had the money, the architects, and the hilltop. Construction began in 1914. The house they would call Carolands began to rise. What rose on that hilltop between 1914 and 1916 was not a house in any ordinary sense of the word. It was a thesis. Harriet Pullman Carolan had spent 2 decades studying the finest architecture in France, and Carolands was her argument that the beauty of the Old World could be transplanted, intact and without compromise, onto American soil. She was not interested in the usual accommodations that wealthy Americans made when they built in European styles, the softened proportions, the concessions to informality, the democratic discomfort with anything that looked too much like a throne room. Carolands would make no such concessions. It would be the real thing. Ernest Sanson designed the house as a composition drawn from several 17th-century chateaux in the Île-de-France, the region surrounding Paris that had produced the masterworks of French classical architecture. The oval projection at the center of the garden facade echoed Vaux-le-Vicomte. The columned pavilions at the ends recalled the Château de Maison designed by Franz Monsart. But Sanson was not merely copying. No respectable Beaux-Arts architect would. He was synthesizing, drawing from the vocabulary of French classicism to create something original and, in its own right, remarkably fine. The result was a building that represented the royal chateau type in a purer form than virtually any other example in the United States. The numbers alone convey the ambition. 98 rooms spread across 4.5 floors. A footprint of roughly 130 feet by 120 feet, a height at its tallest point of nearly 100 feet. More than 46,000 square feet of interior space, making it, at the time of its completion, the largest private residence west of the Mississippi River. The grounds, designed by Duchesne, extended across the full 554 acres, with formal gardens radiating outward from the house in the French manner, disciplined and symmetrical, nature made obedient to geometry. But the heart of Carolands was not its exterior, impressive as that was. The heart was the grand stair hall. Visitors who entered the house found themselves standing at the base of a monumental atrium that rose 75 feet to a skylight overhead. Greek columns lined the space. Gold-accented wrought iron balustrades traced the balconies of the upper floors. Light fell from above in a way that made the entire interior feel less like a room and more like the nave of a cathedral built for no god in particular, but for the idea that human beings could, through architecture, approach something sacred. It was and remains the largest enclosed interior space in any private home in America. The processional staircase that ascended through this space was modeled on the ceremonial stair courts of Baroque royalty, a feature almost never built on this scale in American mansions because its original function, the ritualized movement of kings and courtiers through ascending levels of grandeur, had no equivalent in American life. Harriet built it anyway. She was not building for American life. She was building for the life she believed she deserved. Before the house was even designed, Harriet had purchased 3 antique salons from a mansion in Bordeaux, France. 2 of them dated to 1784, designed by the noted architect Victor Louis, with exquisitely carved boiseries and original marble mantels that had been studied and published by French curators. The third was older still, from the period of Louis XIII. Together, the 3 rooms cost roughly $50,000, equivalent to well over $1 million today. Sanson was given these rooms before he drew his first plans, and in effect the entire house was designed around them, shaped to accommodate their proportions and honor their arrangement from the 18th century. The house did not contain the rooms. The rooms commanded the house. A library was planned to hold 10,000 volumes, reflecting Harriet's devotion to literature. She was a bibliophile of serious credentials, the only American member of Les Amis du Livre Moderne in Paris. And she intended the library at Carolands to be a working collection, not decoration. The Yellow Salon was designed in the style of Louis XVI, with views of the great gardens to the west. There were 25 servants' quarters, a flower arranging room, and, according to one account, a secret floor concealed between the 2nd and 3rd levels. White glass tiles lined the kitchen. The hardware was sourced from Paris. Every element was selected not for effect but for authenticity, which in Harriet's mind were the same thing. The cost of all of this was approximately $1 million. In 1914, that figure was enormous, equivalent to more than $30 million today. The construction proceeded against the backdrop of a world descending into war. Europe, the very civilization Harriet was importing stone by stone into California, was tearing itself apart. Willis Polk supervised the work on the ground while Sanson directed from Paris, where he would remain until his death in January of 1918, never seeing the finished house. Harriet's mother, the formidable Hattie Pullman, looked at the plans. She had watched her husband build a company town and nearly lose everything in a strike. She understood the arithmetic of grandeur. "I am afraid," she told her daughter, "that you will get yourself into trouble and may not have anything after you build it." Harriet did not listen. The house was completed in 1916. The Carolands moved in that fall. Within a year, the trouble her mother had predicted arrived, though it did not come in the form anyone expected. It came from inside the marriage. The building was barely finished when the marriage began to collapse around it. The precise causes are, as with most private disintegrations, not entirely recoverable from the historical record. But the broad strokes are clear enough. The immense cost of Carolands had strained the household finances in ways that could not be concealed. The scale of Harriet's ambition had overwhelmed whatever patience Frank Carolan had once possessed. And the fundamental incompatibility that had shadowed the marriage from its earliest years, her hunger for beauty and permanence against his contentment with polo and society, had finally become unbearable to both of them under the 98-room roof that was supposed to be their shared triumph. Frank Carolan had never asked for a palace. He was a sportsman, a clubman, a man whose pleasures were immediate and physical, the speed of a horse, the arc of a mallet, the warmth of a drink among friends. Carolands was not his language. It was Harriet's, and she spoke it with an intensity that left no room for translation. Every decision about the house, from the selection of the architect to the importation of the Bordeaux salons, had been hers. The vision was hers. The money fundamentally was hers, inherited from a father Frank had never met, and from a fortune built on an industry Frank had no part in. The house bore their combined name, Carolands, but there was little question about whose will had shaped it. The Carolands moved into the completed chateau in the fall of 1916. They occupied it for fewer than 2 years. By 1917, the separation was official. Harriet closed the house and moved to New York. Frank remained in California. He did not stay at Carolands. He took rooms at the Fairmont Hotel, high atop Nob Hill in San Francisco, and continued to play polo with the Burlingame Club. Whatever bitterness he carried it quietly, in the manner of a man whose primary talent was social ease. He did not make public statements. He did not contest the separation with any apparent vigor. He simply left the palace to its emptiness and returned to the life he had been living before his wife decided to build a monument. Harriet, for her part, did not look back. She threw herself into the causes and passions that had always animated her more than domesticity. During the First World War, she became active in the American Friends of France, an organization advocating for American involvement in the conflict. She had served as director of the Fine Arts Department at the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, a role that suited her considerable expertise and her appetite for cultural authority. In New York, she resumed the life of a woman who was more comfortable in the salons of Paris than in any room her husband had ever occupied. Carolands, the house she had spent years conceiving in a fortune building, stood empty on its hill above the bay, its 98 rooms holding nothing but silence. Frank Carolan died on November 12, 1923, at the age of 62. He died at his residence in the Fairmont Hotel. After his death, Harriet sued his estate for more than $1 million, claiming that the money he had spent during their marriage was rightfully hers. She won a portion of it. The legal action was notable less for its outcome than for what it revealed about the nature of the partnership. The fortune had always been hers. The house had always been hers. Frank, in the end, had been a guest in his own marriage, tolerated as long as he did not interfere with the construction. 2 years after Frank's death, Harriet remarried. Her second husband was Colonel Arthur Frederick Schermerhorn, a member of one of New York's oldest Knickerbocker families, a name that carried the weight of Dutch colonial aristocracy. The couple returned briefly to Carolands around 1927, but the visit was short and did not result in any sustained occupancy. By 1928, Harriet began the process of removing her furnishings from the house. The 3 antique French salons, the rooms that had been shipped across an ocean and around which Ernest Sanson had designed the entire building, were carefully dismantled. The carved boiseries, the mirrored doors, the marble mantels were taken out panel by panel and placed in a San Francisco warehouse. The library was emptied. The yellow salon was stripped. By the late 1920s, Carolands was no longer merely unoccupied. It was gutted. In 1929, the Schermerhorns purchased an estate called Spring Lawn in Lenox, Massachusetts, and offered Carolands for sale. Colonel Schermerhorn died in 1933, leaving Harriet a widow for the second time. He died, according to one account, essentially penniless, owing Harriet well over $100,000. She was 64 years old and had now outlasted 2 husbands, 1 fortune, and the grandest private house west of the Mississippi. Harriet finally sold Carolands in 1945 to a developer named Tomlinson Mosley. She was 76. 2 years later, Life magazine covered a charity event held inside the house, the first time many San Francisco residents had seen its interiors. The account described a building that had been abandoned for a quarter century. There was no functioning plumbing. Water was supplied by fire hose. Lighting came from portable generators and floodlights. The grandest house in California was operating, for one evening, on the infrastructure of a construction site. Harriet Pullman Schermerhorn died in October of 1956 at her duplex apartment at 740 Park Avenue in New York City. She was 87 years old. She had no children. She left her possessions to her late sister's family and a fortune to charities. She was laid to rest near her parents in Chicago, not far from the concrete tomb where her father's body lay sealed beneath railroad steel, still unforgiving, still undisturbed. After Harriet left, the land went first. Tomlinson Mosley, the developer who purchased Carolands and its remaining acreage in 1945, had no interest in the house. He had interest in the dirt beneath it, and the subdivisions he could carve from the hillside around it. Within 3 years, he had sold the property, now reduced to 25 acres, to a woman named Sada Coe Robinson. She continued the work of dismemberment. By 1950, the 554 acres that Harriet had purchased in 1912 had been parceled into suburban lots, the formal gardens of a Quai du Chien buried beneath cul-de-sacs and driveways, and the chateau itself sat on fewer than 6 acres of land, a palace marooned on a postage stamp. Robinson contemplated doing what seemed, by then, inevitable. She considered tearing it down. It is worth pausing here to understand what demolition would have meant. Ernest Sanson had died in Paris in 1918 without ever seeing Carolands completed. He left behind only 2 American commissions in his entire career. Quai du Chien's gardens were already gone. Willis Polk, who had supervised the construction, had died in 1924. Every architect who had touched the building was dead. Every craftsman who had carved the stonework, fitted the ironwork, laid the sienna marble was gone or aging beyond the reach of memory. If the wrecking crews arrived, nothing that had been built could be rebuilt. The knowledge was extinct. The demolition of Carolands was announced, and several newspapers reported, incorrectly, that it had already occurred. But Sada Coe Robinson was not, in the end, a villain in this story. The money she made from the Carolands property was used to buy back her family's cattle ranch, which she donated to Santa Clara County. It is known and enjoyed today as Henry W. Coe State Park. She had not set out to destroy the chateau. She simply could not find anyone willing to save it. Someone was willing. Her name was Lillian Remillard, and she arrived at Carolands the way she arrived at most things in her life, on her own terms, and with a title she had arguably no right to use. Lillian was born in Oakland in 1880, the daughter of Pierre-Nicolas Remillard, a French-Canadian who had come to California during the gold rush and stayed to build a brick empire. The Remillard Brothers Company had supplied bricks to San Francisco since the 1850s, and when the earthquake and fire of 1906 leveled much of the city, the rebuilding that followed made the family enormously wealthy. Lillian grew up rich, cultured, and independent. She studied singing in New York and, by her own account, was on the verge of joining the Metropolitan Opera when the earthquake called her home to help rebuild. Whether that story was entirely true is a matter of some debate. What is not debatable is that Lillian Remillard possessed a dramatic sensibility that she applied to every aspect of her existence. In 1932, at the age of 52, she married Count Alessandro Dondini di Cesena, a Mexican-born Italian aristocrat and university professor who was 20 years her junior. The marriage lasted 12 tempestuous years before he filed for divorce in Nevada, remarried, and moved to Reno. Lillian refused to recognize the Nevada divorce. For the remaining 4 decades of her life, she continued to style herself Countess Lillian Remillard Dondini. The title, however questionable its legal standing, gave her a position in society that she occupied with absolute conviction. She was a woman who understood that if you behaved as though something were true for long enough, the world would eventually stop arguing. In 1950, the Countess purchased Carolands and its last remaining 6 acres for approximately $80,000. She moved in and renamed the property Chateau Remillard. She was 70 years old, alone, and had just bought a 98-room mansion with no functioning plumbing, no intact interiors, and a maintenance burden that would have given pause to a small municipality. She did not hesitate. Over the following years, the Countess set about making Carolands a living house again. She could not afford to restore it to its original grandeur, not entirely, but she could inhabit it, and inhabiting it was its own form of rescue. In 1958, she tracked down the 2 Bordeaux salons that Harriet had stripped from the walls 3 decades earlier and had placed in storage. They had survived. The Countess purchased them from Harriet's estate and had them reinstalled in the spaces Sanssouci had designed for them. The carved boiseries fitted back against the exposed brick walls, the mirrored doors rehung, the proportions of the 18th century restored within the shell of the 20th. It was an act of architectural devotion that very few people ever saw. What people did see were the parties. The Countess was a lavish and generous hostess. She opened the great halls of Carolands for charity benefits, most notably for the Opera League of Oakland, filling the rooms with music and guests in a manner that echoed, however faintly, the life Harriet had imagined for the house but never lived. Bing Crosby, her neighbor, attended. Liberace performed. The French community of San Francisco was invited annually. For 23 years, the Countess held Carolands together through sheer force of personality and a willingness to spend money she could not always afford on a building that demanded more than any single person could give. Countess Lillian Remillard Dandini died at Carolands on July 1, 1973. She was 93 years old. Her funeral was held in the library, the room Harriet had designed to hold 10,000 volumes, the room where the Countess had perhaps felt closest to the woman whose dream she had inherited and tried, in her own eccentric and magnificent way, to keep alive. In her will, she left Carolands to the town of Hillsborough, with the wish that it be used as an arts center and cultural venue. The town of Hillsborough declined the gift. No provisions had been made for the cost of maintenance, and the elected officials saw no path forward that did not lead to financial ruin. The Countess had saved the building from the wrecking ball. She could not save it from what came next. What happens to a palace when no one can afford to love it? It does not simply decay. It becomes something else entirely. It becomes a provocation, a dare, a hollow monument to the distance between what a building was designed to be and what the world has decided it is worth. In the years after the Countess died, Carolands became all of these things, and then it became something worse. It became dangerous. The decline began with bureaucracy. When Hillsborough refused the Countess's bequest, the property passed to the state of California. The state, in turn, could find no viable use for a 98-room mansion on fewer than 6 acres, and by 1975 it effectively gave the building away. That same year, Carolands was designated a California Historic Landmark and placed on the National Register of Historic Places, twin honors that recognized the architectural significance of the structure but did nothing whatsoever to pay for its upkeep. A plaque on a building is not a roof. A listing in a federal registry does not replace a boiler. Carolands had been officially recognized as irreplaceable at the precise moment when no one was willing to spend $1 to keep it standing. What followed was a carousel of owners, each one arriving with either too little money or too much ambition, and each one departing having been defeated by the house. In 1976, the property was sold at auction for $313,000 to Rose Franks, an heiress whose fortune reportedly derived from oil and real estate. Franks was said to genuinely care about the building, but her tenure was brief and bitter. By 1979, she had lost a legal battle to a developer named George Benny, who took control of the chateau. Franks was reportedly heartbroken at the loss. She would not have to grieve for long. Within 3 years, George Benny's $200 million real estate empire collapsed. He lost Carolands to foreclosure and was subsequently sentenced to 30 years in federal prison for racketeering. The chateau had passed through the hands of a convicted criminal and emerged no better for the experience. If anything, it emerged worse. Each change of ownership meant another period of vacancy, another stretch of months or years in which the plumbing corroded a little further, the roof admitted a little more rain, and the plaster cracked along lines that had once been invisible. By the early 1980s, Carolands was an abandoned building in one of the wealthiest communities in the United States. It was fenced, it was monitored by a private security company, and it was irresistible. The sheer scale of the place, the Gothic grandeur of its empty rooms, the knowledge that behind those gates sat a crumbling palace that no one was permitted to enter. All of it made Carolands a magnet for trespassers, thrill-seekers, and anyone drawn to the romance of ruin. Teenagers from nearby Burlingame and San Mateo treated it as a destination, a haunted house that happened to be real. Local police fielded regular complaints about juveniles entering the property. The security guards, hired to keep people out, sometimes let them in. In 1984, the building suffered an indignity that would have been unimaginable to the woman who had imported antique salons from Bordeaux and hired the finest architect in France. A film crew gained unauthorized access to the property and shot a pornographic movie inside its rooms. The film was called All American Girls. It was produced quickly and cheaply, using the decayed grandeur of Carolands as a backdrop, the peeling plaster and broken chandeliers serving as set decoration for scenes that required no set decoration at all. The house that Harriet Pullman Carolan had built to rival the estates of European royalty, the house where Countess Dandini had hosted Liberace and welcomed the French community of San Francisco, was now, in the most literal sense, being exploited. It is easy to treat this episode as a punchline, and many accounts of Carolands have done exactly that. But the pornographic film was not a joke. It was a symptom. It revealed what Carolands had become in the absence of an owner, a caretaker, or a community willing to take responsibility for it. The building had become a void, and voids attract whatever is willing to fill them. The grand stair hall that rose 75 feet to the skylight, the largest enclosed space in any private home in America, was no longer a testament to human aspiration. It was a testament to human indifference. No one was watching. No one was accountable. The doors that should have been locked were not locked. The rooms that should have been empty were not always empty. And it was in this condition, unoccupied, unmonitored in any meaningful sense, guarded by a rotating staff of private security employees who answered to no one in particular, that Carolands entered the winter of 1985. The house sat on its hill in the fog, its windows dark, its interiors stripped, its reputation reduced to local legend and local joke. Teenagers still came. The guards still sometimes let them in. One guard in particular had developed a habit of offering unofficial tours to young visitors, especially young women. He was 23 years old. His name was David Allen Rayleigh. He had worked previously as a security guard at a shopping mall. He owned a police scanner. He dressed and talked and tried to carry himself like a law enforcement officer, though he was not one and had never been one. He liked to take his visitors into the basement rooms and ask them to scream, so he could demonstrate how thick the walls were, how completely the sound was swallowed by the stone. No one, he told them, could hear anything down there. He said this to more than one young woman in the months before February of 1985. He said it with what witnesses would later describe as a particular kind of enthusiasm. And no one, not the security company, not the property owner, not the town of Hillsborough, did anything about it. On the afternoon of Saturday, February 2nd, two teenage girls drove up the hill toward the chateau. They had heard that the guards sometimes gave tours. They were 16 and 17 years old. They wanted to see the inside of the palace. Janine Grinsell was 16 years old. She had recently gotten her driver's license. Lori McKenna was 17, a senior at Burlingame High School. They were friends, and on the afternoon of Saturday, February 2nd, 1985, they were driving through the neighborhoods of San Mateo County with no particular destination in mind, doing what teenagers do when the day is open and the world feels large. Someone had mentioned that the security guards at Carolands sometimes gave tours. The old mansion on the hill was a known curiosity in the area, a place that older kids talked about, a ruin that carried the particular glamour of abandonment. They drove up. David Allen Rayleigh was the guard on duty. He agreed to let them in on one condition. He told them to park their car where no one could see it. They did. Rayleigh had done this before. He had given unauthorized tours to other visitors, other young women. During these tours, he had made comments that, in retrospect, formed a clear and escalating pattern. He had brought one woman into a room and asked her to scream so she could hear how the sound disappeared into the walls. He had told another visitor how easy it would be to kill someone inside the mansion and never be discovered. On the very morning of February 2nd, a journalism student had visited Carolands to write a story about the house. Rayleigh spoke to her. His remarks were later described as unsettling, though the precise content has not been fully reported. By the afternoon, the journalism student was gone. Janine and Laurie arrived. He took them through the house, the grand stair hall with its 75-foot atrium, the stripped salons, the empty library. The rooms that had once held 10,000 volumes and the accumulated beauty of a woman who had loved France more than she had loved anything else in her life. Now those rooms held nothing. Dust and silence, and a man who had been waiting for the right opportunity. At the end of the tour, Rayleigh told the girls that police dogs had arrived on the property and that they needed to hide. He led them down to a basement vault, a walk-in safe. He told them he would not close the door. He closed it. When he opened it again, he was armed. What followed is documented in court records from the state of California. Rayleigh chained the two girls. He sexually assaulted them. He stabbed each of them more than 30 times. When it was over, he wrapped their bodies in carpets, carried them to his car, and placed them in the trunk. Then he drove to his home in San Jose. He spent the evening watching television with his sister. He played a board game. In the middle of the night, he drove to a remote area and left both girls in a muddy ravine. They were both still alive. Laurie McKenna, stabbed more than 30 times, managed to climb out of the ravine. She reached a road. She flagged down help. She survived, and her account would become the central testimony in the trial that followed. Janine Grinsell did not survive. She died of her wounds at the hospital. She was 16 years old. Rayleigh was arrested and charged with murder, attempted murder, 2 counts of assault with intent to commit rape, and 2 counts of kidnapping. The Santa Clara County District Attorney sought the death penalty, citing special circumstances including torture. The trial took place in 1987. Laurie McKenna testified. Rayleigh was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death. He has remained incarcerated since his conviction, his death sentence later commuted to life, without the possibility of parole under a statewide moratorium. There is a version of this story that focuses on the perpetrator, that tries to explain him, to locate the origin of what he did in some psychological framework that makes the incomprehensible slightly less so. This is not that version. David Allen Rayleigh was a man who was given unsupervised access to an empty building and used it to do what he had, by all available evidence, been rehearsing for months. The relevant question is not what was wrong with him. The relevant question is why he was there at all. Carolands in February of 1985 was a 69-year-old mansion, worth millions of dollars in architectural significance and nothing at all in practical terms. It had no functioning owner with the resources to maintain it. It had no municipal oversight. It had no ensemble system, no surveillance, no protocol for vetting the men who were hired to walk its perimeter at night. It had a fence and a security contract, and the security company employed a 23-year-old man with no law enforcement training, no background check that surfaced his pattern of behavior, and a documented habit of luring young women into the basement to show them how soundproof it was. The building did not kill Janine Grinsell. But the building's abandonment, the collective failure of every institution and individual that could have taken responsibility for it and chose not to, created the conditions in which her death became possible. Harriet Pullman Carolan built Carolands because she believed that beauty, properly executed, could outlast the frailties of the people who created it. She was right about the outlasting. The beauty had survived. What it attracted, in the absence of anyone willing to protect it, was not admiration. It was predation. The grandest room in the house, the one where no one could hear you scream, was not grand because of what it represented. It was grand because of what it permitted. After the murder, Carolands receded from public attention for a time. The house remained standing. The house always remained standing. In 1989, the earth beneath it shifted, and the building faced a threat that had nothing to do with human cruelty and everything to do with the ground on which it had been built. On October 17, 1989, at 5:04 in the evening, the Loma Prieta segment of the San Andreas Fault ruptured beneath the Santa Cruz Mountains. The earthquake registered a magnitude of 6.9 and lasted approximately 15 seconds. 63 people were killed across the Bay Area. Freeways collapsed. Fires broke out in the Marina District of San Francisco. The World Series, underway at Candlestick Park, was suspended mid-game. It was the most destructive seismic event in Northern California since 1906. The same earthquake whose rebuilding had made the Remillard family rich enough to one day produce a countess who would save a chateau from demolition. Carolands, sitting on its hilltop in Hillsborough, absorbed the blow. The building sustained damage, though the full extent was difficult to assess because the structure had already been deteriorating for years. Cracks that had been slowly propagating through the plaster and masonry were now wider. Settling that had been gradual was now pronounced. The earthquake did not destroy Carolands, but it accelerated the entropy that had been working on the building since the day the Countess died. For a structure that had already survived abandonment, bankruptcy, exploitation, and murder, the Loma Prieta earthquake was one more indignity in a long procession of them, and for many in Hillsborough, it appeared to be the final one. The consensus, spoken and unspoken, was that the building was beyond rescue. Demolition, the outcome that had been deferred for 4 decades, seemed at last unavoidable. But Carolands had a quality that defied practical assessment. Even in ruin, even stripped of its furnishings and scarred by neglect, the building possessed a physical presence that was difficult to dismiss. The bones were extraordinary. The proportions that Ernest Sanson had calibrated with such precision in 1913 were still legible beneath the damage. The grand stair hall still rose 75 feet to the skylight. The Bordeaux salons, reinstalled by the Countess in 1958, were still intact within their walls. The structure was wounded, but the architecture, the underlying argument that Harriet Pullman Carolan had made in stone and iron and glass, had not been refuted. It was waiting for someone who could read it. In the early 1990s, an effort was made to raise money and awareness for the building through a charity decorator showcase. These events, common among preservation organizations, invite interior designers to furnish individual rooms in a historic house, which is then open to the public for a limited time. The Carolands Showcase drew visitors who had never been inside the chateau, people who climbed the grand staircase and stood in the atrium, and understood, perhaps for the first time, what was at stake if the building were lost. Among the visitors was Anne Johnson, the wife of Charles Bartlett Johnson, a billionaire whose fortune derived from the Franklin Templeton investment firm. Anne Johnson was not a casual attendee. She was accompanied by her decorator, a man named Mario Buada. Buada was one of the most celebrated interior designers in the United States, known as the Prince of Chintz for his lavish English country house style. He had overseen the redecoration of Blair House, the presidential guest residence in Washington. His most recent major project had been completed, and he was by temperament and profession a man who looked at damaged rooms the way a surgeon looks at a patient. He saw not what was broken, but what could be repaired. What Anne Johnson and Mario Buada saw inside Carolands that day was something that decades of neglect had not managed to erase. A sleeping beauty, the Carolands historian Paul Price would later call it. The phrase was apt. The building was not dead. It was dormant, buried under layers of decay and institutional failure, but structurally sound in its essentials and architecturally magnificent in a way that no amount of money could replicate if it were ever torn down. Anne Johnson understood this. More importantly, she and her husband had the resources to act on that understanding. In 1998, Charles and Anne Johnson purchased Carolands for less than $6 million. The price was almost absurd given the scale and significance of the building, but it reflected the reality that no one else was willing to take on what came with the purchase. The Johnsons committed to a full restoration, and what followed was a 4-year reconstruction effort estimated at $20 million. The mechanical systems were replaced. Asbestos was removed. The roof, which had been failing for years, was entirely rebuilt. The exterior stonework was repaired and repointed. Inside, Mario Buada undertook what would become the most extensive project of his career, designing interiors that honored Sanson's original vision while making the house livable for a modern family. The ballroom received French doors that opened to the gardens and mirrored double doors opening to the gallery. A stage was installed at one end for musicians. The loggia was filled with plants and paved in yellow marble from Siena. Where original hardware from Paris had gone missing, computer simulation was used to create precise replacements. The work was painstaking, historically informed, and enormously expensive. The Johnsons moved into the restored Carolands in 2002. For the first time in its history, the chateau was occupied by a family that could afford both to live in it and to maintain it. They hosted charity events in the great rooms, opening the building in the tradition the Countess had established half a century earlier. They lived there for 10 years. In 2012, Charles and Anne Johnson donated Carolands to the Carolands Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving the chateau for charitable purposes and architectural study. The building that had been built by an heiress, abandoned by a marriage, saved by a countess, violated by predators, and shaken by an earthquake was now, for the first time, owned by no one and everyone. It was a foundation asset. It would be maintained in perpetuity, open for tours by appointment, its rooms preserved as they had been restored. The Johnsons had spent $26 million and 14 years of their lives on a building they ultimately chose not to keep. They gave it away. The palace, as always, remained. Stand at the base of the grand staircase today and look up. The atrium rises 75 feet above you, light falling through the skylight the way it has fallen every morning since 1916. The Greek columns are intact. The gold-accented wrought iron balustrades trace the balconies of the upper floors in the same arcs that Ernest Sanson drew in his Paris studio more than a century ago. The Bordeaux salons are in their rooms, the carved boiseries fitted against the walls exactly as they were when they were first installed in a mansion in France in 1784, removed, shipped across an ocean, stripped out, warehoused for 3 decades, reinstalled by a countess, and finally restored by a billionaire's decorator. The library is filled again. The yellow salon overlooks the gardens. The marble in the loggia is still from Siena. It is beautiful. It was always beautiful. That was never the question. The question is what it cost, and who paid. Harriet Pullman Carolan paid with her marriage. She conceived Carolands as the fullest expression of everything she valued: beauty, permanence, the transplantation of French civilization onto a California hilltop, and it consumed her household in the process. She lived in her creation for 2 years. She spent the remaining 4 decades of her life in apartments and borrowed estates, a woman of extraordinary taste and culture who built the most magnificent private home west of the Mississippi and then walked away from it. She never returned in any meaningful sense. When she died in 1956 at 740 Park Avenue, Carolands had been empty for most of her adult life. The house outlasted her by the simple expedient of not needing her. Frank Carolan paid with his dignity. He was a man of modest ambitions married to a woman of limitless ones, and the house she built became the physical manifestation of everything that separated them. He died alone at the Fairmont Hotel, a polo player to the end, remembered primarily as the man whose name was attached to a building he never wanted. Countess Dandini paid with her fortune. She saved Carolands from demolition out of a love for French architecture and a flair for dramatic gestures, and she spent 23 years pouring money into a structure that could never be fully maintained by a single person, however determined. She died in its library, bequeathed it to a town that did not want it, and left behind a building that honored her devotion by immediately beginning to fall apart again. Rose Franks paid with her heartbreak, losing the chateau in a legal battle to a man who would later go to prison. George Benny paid with his freedom. The nameless parade of owners and developers who cycled through the property in the 1970s and 80s each paid in their own way, in lawsuits, in foreclosures, in the quiet humiliations of discovering that a building can be too grand to maintain and too significant to destroy, leaving its owner paralyzed between ruin and responsibility. Janine Grinsell paid with her life. She was 16 years old and wanted to see the inside of a palace. She walked through the front door of a building that should have been locked, secured, monitored, or simply torn down years earlier, and she did not walk out. Her death was not caused by the building, it was caused by a man. But it was made possible by the vacuum that the building had created around itself, the decades of institutional indifference that left a masterpiece of French classical architecture in the hands of an unsupervised 23-year-old with a set of keys and a habit of testing how much he could get away with. The architecture did not fail her. The people responsible for the architecture did. Laurie McKenna survived, and her survival was the act of will that made justice possible. She climbed out of a ravine with more than 30 stab wounds and flagged down help on a road in the dark. She testified at trial. She provided the account that sent David Allen Rayleigh to prison for the rest of his life. Her courage was her own. It had nothing to do with the building. And Charles and Ann Johnson paid $26 million, a decade of labor, and the emotional weight of living inside a house where a girl had been murdered, to restore a building they ultimately gave away. They did not keep it. They could not keep it, not because they lacked the means, but because they understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone who had come before them, that Carolands was not a house that could be owned. It was a house that owned you. The only way to survive it was to let it go. This is the pattern. It is the same pattern that played out at the Château de Vaux-le-Vicomte 350 years ago. Nicolas Fouquet built his palace to display his greatness, and the palace displayed it so effectively that it provoked a king and destroyed him. The architects and artisans who built Vaux-le-Vicomte were taken from Fouquet and put to work on Versailles. The man was erased. The building endured. Today, Vaux-le-Vicomte is open to the public, maintained by a private foundation, its gardens restored, its interiors preserved. Visitors walk through the same rooms where Fouquet hosted his fatal dinner. They admire the proportions. They take photographs. They leave. Carolands stands on its hill above the San Francisco Bay, open by appointment, maintained by the Carolands Foundation, its rooms pristine, its atrium flooded with light that has not changed in 110 years. It has no family. It has no heiress. It has no countess. It has a non-profit board and a tour schedule, and the quiet permanence of an institution that exists for its own preservation. Whether that is a triumph, or simply the building's final victory over every person who tried to make it a home, is a question the visitor must answer for themselves. The palace was built with money extracted from the wages of workers who could not afford to feed their families. It was designed by an architect who never saw it completed. It was abandoned by the woman who dreamed it into existence. It was saved by a countess who died inside it. It was the site of a murder that should never have been possible. It was shaken by an earthquake and restored by strangers. It survived all of it. It survived everyone. Harriet Pullman Carolan once stood where you would stand today, at the base of that staircase, and looked up. She saw what she had built, and she believed it was permanent. She was right about the building. She was wrong about herself. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.